Okay, so this story we're diving into today, it feels like something you'd see in a movie.
Oh, yeah.
Like a political thriller or something. We're talking about Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister,
Right.
facing arrest warrants from the International Criminal Court, no less.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Huge.
Yeah.
And I know we've got a ton to unpack here. You sent over articles from all over France, 24,
Yeah.
the New York Times,
Yeah.
Al Jazeera even.
Yep.
So
And it's
let's get into it.
yeah, it really is fascinating, not just the charges themselves,
Right.
but the fallout, the potential fallout from this for the ICC and really for international justice as a whole.
Yeah, and you're the expert at connecting those dots, so that's what I'm really interested to hear.
Yeah.
But first, let's lay out the basics for our listener, just so everyone's on the same page.
Sure.
The ICC issued these warrants for Netanyahu,
Right.
his former defense minister, Yoav Gallant,
Uh-huh.
and Hamas military chief, Mohammed Daif.
That's right. And the accusations are pretty serious. We're talking war crimes and crimes against humanity, specifically related to the war in Gaza.
Okay.
And the ICC is alleging that they use starvation as a method of warfare, which is essentially restricting humanitarian aid to the region.
Okay, so that's something I wanted to ask about because it seems like some countries
Yeah.
are taking this super seriously, like Ireland, for example.
Right.
They've said they would arrest Netanyahu if he sets foot in their country.
Yeah.
But then you've got others like Italy who are kind of like, wait a minute, is this even legal?
Yeah, it's a complete mess.
Yeah.
And it really exposes, I think, one of the fundamental tensions within international law.
Okay.
You have the ICC, right?
Uh-huh.
Which was established to hold individuals accountable
Right.
for the worst crimes regardless of their position.
Uh-huh.
But then you also have the concept of state sovereignty and this thing called immunity for heads of state.
Okay, yeah, that's where I need you to like ELI 5 for me, immunity for heads of state. Like, what does that even mean in this situation?
Yeah, so it's a complex legal principle with a long history. Basically, it means that in some cases, leaders of countries are considered immune from prosecution in foreign courts while they're carrying out their official duties. And it's meant to make sure that, diplomatic relations can go smoothly and to prevent prosecutions that are politically motivated. The key is that it's not absolute immunity.
Okay, so some countries are saying this immunity protects Netanyahu because Israel isn't even an ICC member. But then others are saying, well, war crimes are different. Like, you can't hide behind immunity when it comes to that kind of stuff.
That's exactly right. It's a real legal tug of war. And it's all playing out so publicly in a really politically charged way. And one country's response in particular has really been raising eyebrows.
Oh, I know exactly what you're going to say. France.
Yeah, because they're an ICC member.
Everyone was like, okay, France is going to be all about enforcing these warrants. But then they basically said, well, Netanyahu probably has immunity. And this seems to totally contradict their stance on Putin, who's in a similar situation with the ICC,
Yes.
but isn't a member.
It does seem contradictory, and that's why you see critics accusing France of, selective enforcement, of basically playing favorites based on political alliances instead of upholding international law consistently.
Yeah, like, are they just picking and choosing who they want to apply the law to?
Right.
And wait, isn't France also saying they're going to keep working closely with Netanyahu?
Yeah.
I mean, talk about a diplomatic tightrope walk.
It is. France is trying to balance its obligations as an ICC member, right, with its strategic relationship with Israel.
Right.
And this really gets to the heart of why this is also fascinating. It's a test case. It's a real-time test case for what the ICC can actually do and how messy international diplomacy really is.
So are we saying that even if the ICC wants to hold these powerful leaders accountable, real politics often gets in the way? That's kind of disheartening when you think about all the victims involved in all this.
I think it's a valid concern. The ICC relies on member states cooperating with them to enforce their decisions.
Right.
And when you're dealing with someone like Netanyahu, who has powerful allies backing him up, those political calculations become even more complex.
Okay, this is getting really heavy and we're just getting started. But before we move on, there's one piece I want to make sure our listener understands because this term keeps popping up in these articles. Universal jurisdiction.
Yes, that's a crucial concept. So basically, universal jurisdiction means that certain crimes are so heinous, like genocide and torture and crimes against humanity, that any state can prosecute them. It doesn't matter where the crime happened or what the nationality of the perpetrator is.
Wow.
It's a powerful tool in the fight against impunity, for sure.
So critics of France are saying, look, even if Israel isn't an ICC member, this whole idea of universal jurisdiction means that France should still be willing to arrest Netanyahu.
Right.
But that leads to another question, and this one's for you.
Let me guess. What about the people who support France's decision?
You read my mind.
Yeah.
I know there are two sides to every coin.
Of course. The people who are defending France's stance often point to the practical side of things. They say arresting a sitting prime minister, especially from such a key ally like Israel, could cause a lot of problems diplomatically and even put regional stability at risk.
So it's like they're walking this kite rope.
Yeah.
They want to uphold international law, but they also don't want to mess up these important political alliances.
Yeah.
Not an easy position to be in.
No, it really highlights that tension between what the law says and what actually happens in international relations.
Yeah, it's messy. And speaking of messy, this brings us to Israel's reaction, which I don't think will surprise our listener.
Oh, yeah. Israel is not happy. They've come out swinging, saying these warrants are baseless.
Right.
And denying that the ICC has any power over them since they're not a member state.
It's like we're watching some high-stakes legal chess match play out in real time.
It really is.
They've also said they're going to appeal.
Yeah.
And they're demanding these warrants be suspended while that happens.
Smart move. It buys them some time.
Yeah.
And shifts the focus to the procedure.
Right.
And some Israeli officials think they have another ace up their sleeve. The possibility of Donald Trump returning to the White House.
Yes, the Trump factor. Explain that one to me, because I'm sure our listeners are wondering what that has to do with anything.
So you remember during his presidency,
Trump
was not a fan of the ICC.
Right.
He even put sanctions on some of their officials.
Uh-huh.
Some people in Israel think if he's reelected, he might pressure the ICC to back down or even push for sanctions against any country that honors the warrants.
So it's not just legal arguments and diplomatic maneuvering. It's about political power plays, too.
Absolutely.
And all these different what-if scenarios.
Yeah, you got to think ahead. It shows you that international law doesn't exist in some bubble. It's always tangled up with politics and who has power in the world.
Okay, so we've got this standoff between Israel and the ICC.
Right.
What about everyone else? How are other countries reacting to this diplomatic earthquake?
Well, it's a mixed bag.
Okay.
A whole range of responses. You've got countries like Ireland, who we talked about. They're standing firm. They said they'll arrest Netanyahu if he sets foot on their soil.
Wow.
They're committed to international law. That's their priority.
That's a strong stance.
It is. But then you have countries like Italy who have expressed serious doubts about whether it's even practically possible or even legal to arrest a sitting prime minister. Seems like they're putting diplomatic stability first over strictly following the ICC's warrants.
So different countries, different priorities.
Yeah, it's a tough decision for a lot of them. They've got to weigh their legal obligations against their political and economic ties with Israel.
Right.
No easy answers here.
And we can't forget about the human rights groups.
Oh, yeah, they're not staying quiet.
I imagine they have a lot to say.
They do. They're speaking out pretty forcefully, actually.
Oh.
Condemning France's stance. They say allowing politics to trump international law sets a really dangerous precedent.
So they're saying if you make exceptions for powerful leaders, the whole system falls apart.
Exactly. They're fighting for the principle that no one is above the law. Not even heads of state. They say this case is a major test for the ICC.
Right.
And whether it can actually deter these kinds of atrocities.
That's a powerful argument.
Yeah.
But it clashes with this whole idea of immunity for heads of state, which we talked about before.
Yeah, it's uncharted territory, legally and diplomatically.
It really is. This case is really pushing the boundaries of international law.
It is.
It's forcing us to ask some hard questions. Like, can the ICC actually hold powerful leaders accountable?
Right.
And what happens when those leaders have powerful friends who are willing to shield them?
It makes you wonder how effective the ICC can really be in the long run.
Yeah.
If their decisions can be ignored so easily, what kind of deterrent is that really?
So this whole situation could actually weaken the ICC's authority.
Potentially, yeah.
And embolden people who are committing these horrible crimes.
It's a worry.
This is getting kind of depressing, to be honest.
It is a sobering thought. But I think it's important to remember that the ICC is a pretty young institution.
Okay.
It's still developing, and it's facing some big challenges. This case might be a setback.
Right.
But it's also a chance to learn and adapt.
You're right. It's not time to give up on the idea of international justice just yet.
No.
Maybe this is a wake-up call for the whole international community.
Yeah.
To find ways to strengthen the ICC and make sure its decisions are enforced no matter what the political pressure is.
Exactly. This case is shining a light on the flaws in the system.
Yeah.
It's time to rethink how we hold leaders accountable for these international crimes.
But let's not forget about the human cost here.
Of course.
While the diplomats and lawyers are arguing, the victims of the Gaza conflict are still waiting for justice.
You're absolutely right. Their stories are so important, and they shouldn't be forgotten.
It's crucial to hear from the people who've been most affected.
Yes, their experiences are essential.
This deep dive has been like peeling back the layers of an onion.
I know, right?
More complexity with every layer.
It shows you how complicated international law is.
And how hard it is to achieve justice on a global scale.
Yeah.
And speaking of peeling back layers, there's another aspect of this story that I think we need to talk about.
Okay.
Something we haven't explored yet. So we've talked about, the global implications, all the legal back and forth. But what about Netanyahu himself? Like, what does this actually mean for him?
Yeah, I mean, personally and politically, this could really shake things up for him.
Yeah.
Even if he never actually ends up in court. Imagine being a world leader and suddenly you can't travel to a bunch of countries.
Yeah.
Because you might get arrested.
That's got to be a huge headache.
Oh, absolutely. Especially for someone like him who relies on those international relationships.
Right. He can't exactly do diplomacy if he's stuck at home.
It throws a wrench in everything.
Yeah.
Summits, state visits, even just basic travel becomes so risky. He'd constantly be wondering who's going to honor the warrant and who's going to look the other way.
So stressful. But beyond the travel stuff, this has got to have implications for him back in Israel too, right?
Yeah.
Like politically.
Oh, yeah, for sure. This is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
You'd think facing war crimes charges would automatically make a leader unpopular.
Yeah.
But it's not always that simple.
Okay, break that down for me and for our listener who might not be following Israeli politics super closely.
So some Israelis might actually rally around Netanyahu.
Really?
They might see this whole thing as an attack on Israel itself. Like the world is biased against them.
Okay.
And that could actually strengthen his support among his base.
But I bet there are others who see this whole thing totally differently.
Oh, absolutely. There's a whole segment of the population that's been critical of Netanyahu for a long time.
Right, especially his policies towards the Palestinians.
Exactly. And for those people, these warrants might be seen as proof that he's gone too far.
Yeah.
It could lead to more calls for him to resign.
Mm-hmm.
Add more fuel to the fire in Israeli politics, which is already pretty volatile.
So it's not just about legal guilt or innocence. It's about how this plays out in a court of public opinion.
Yeah, both in Israel and globally.
And there's the impact on the Israeli people, too. This whole thing could make the tensions and divisions in their society even worse.
It's true. The conflict with the Palestinians is already so sensitive.
Right.
This just adds another layer of complexity.
Yeah.
Another reason for people to dig in their heels on both sides.
It reminds us that even when we talk about these big international legal issues, these high-level political figures, there are real human consequences.
Absolutely. People's lives are affected, their sense of security, their hopes for peace.
It's all connected.
All tangled up together.
It makes you wonder if international justice is even possible.
Right.
When things are this messy, this political.
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
This whole case is like a mirror for the ICC.
Okay.
Showing us its strengths, but also its weaknesses. It reminds us that even though justice is so important, the road to get there is rarely easy.
You said earlier that maybe this isn't about saying the ICC is a failure.
Right.
But about recognizing that it needs to change and adapt.
Exactly. We need institutions that can hold these powerful people accountable.
Yeah.
But those institutions have to be strong and flexible. They need to be able to stand up to political pressure and find ways to make sure justice is done, even when it's really difficult.
Well, this deep dive has taken us everywhere.
I know, it's been quite a journey.
From these war crimes allegations to legal debates, global power struggles, the human cost of conflict.
It's a lot to process.
I feel like we've just scratched the surface.
Yeah, but it's given us a lot to think about.
Definitely. And hopefully our listeners too.
For sure.
And it's not over yet.
No, this story is going to keep unfolding. The legal battles, the political maneuvering, what happens with Netanyahu, with Israel, with the ICC itself.
It's all still up in the air.
Exactly.
So on that note, we'll leave our listeners with a final thought.
Okay.
If this case shows us anything, it's that international justice isn't something we can just sit back and watch.
It's not a spectator sport.
We have to be involved. We have to think critically and be willing to face the hard realities of the world.
Yeah.
What role do we want to play in making sure people are held accountable for these international crimes?
Right.
What kind of world do we want to live in?
Big questions.
They're not easy questions, but they're worth asking ourselves.